Casual Magic has been brought to you by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can get cool stuff. Use the code CASUAL to get 5% off of your sale. And then also by Coalesce Apparel, where you can get really cool t-shirts and stuff, and use the code CASUALMAGIC to get 10% off your sale. And by Archidect, a deck hosting website that doesn't really sell anything, but they like me and I like them, so kindly use them. And now, on to the show. Hello and welcome to Casual Magic, the show where we talk about the fun side of Magic the Gathering. My name is Shivam, Bhatt, and Casual Magic is brought to you by Cool Stuff Inc., Archidect, and Coalesce Apparel. Today, I'm actually stepping away from Magic for just a few minutes to talk about my other favorite thing in the world, Dungeons and Dragons, because I have with me today a very special pair of guests. It's weird because I don't normally have two guests. My Zencaster is stacking, and I don't know how to deal with that. Where do I look? But yeah, I have Greg, Tito, and Shelly Mazzanoble, who are the community people, managers. They run the podcast called Dragon Talk that I like to listen to a lot, which is the D&D official podcast. I guess that is it. The official podcast,
It
right?
is.
Yes, it is.
And I've known both of these two for many, many years. Well, Shelly in passing, less so than Greg, who I've hung out with. But they put out a book, I guess, compiling all the various interviews and stuff you've done with cool people about D&D. And I thought it was really neat, and I wanted to talk to you about that. Hello, both. Welcome to my show.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, excited to be here and chat about D&D, which has magic in it because you can cast magic
And
spells.
Yeah.
you have to gather to play it.
True.
The
There's
similarities.
a lot of crossover, even
Yeah.
more now in recent years
You
between
know
those
what?
two brands.
Baldur's Gate was a phenomenal set, and
Yeah.
so was Adventures in Forgotten Realms. And someday,
Yeah.
maybe they'll get to a setting that I care about. Where's my Spelljammer set, Magic?
Oh, that would be
Please
amazing.
give me my space hamsters. That's all I'm saying.
Just want to cast that. That'd be so great.
All I'm saying is Jeff Grubb did work on Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, Planescape, and Magic the Gathering. Maybe we can have a multiverse.
Love it.
I should get him on the show. He would be amazing. Yeah, but so I am really interested to hear internally you guys work on trying the episodes that I've heard of yours, of which of many is you had interview people and ask them basically what their relationship with D&D is in their life and in their kind of passions and stuff. Sort of basically like what I do here on Casual Magic, except for my other half. What has it been like? What have you guys taken away from your interviews that you think is so interesting that you would want to put into a book?
That's a very good question. I think, wow, this community of D&D players is quite incredible, quite diverse, quite eclectic, coming from many different walks of life. We have talked to people from Hollywood, actors, directors, animators, producers. We've talked to people who are cosplayers. We've talked to people who are streamers. There is a multitude of ways that D&D has touched people's lives. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is just how impactful this game has been on the lives of so many people, and whether that was because they were playing D&D and had discovered something important about themselves through it. They were playing D&D and they met their friends from 30 years ago that they're still best friends with today, or because they have found themselves in a career that's creative driven, and they learned story building, character building, world building from playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I think for me, it's really just been just such a constant weekly reassurance of how great this game is and how lucky we are that every day we get to come to work and help bring this game to more people.
Yeah, I can second that too. And I think that it's something that's come out with talking about this is that we get that affirmation every single day that our day jobs of I'm the communications manager for D&D, so just trying to get the word out about all of our new products, as well as just in general about what makes D&D special. But we have basically weekly single person focus groups who tell us exactly what is so great about it each week. And so we haven't lost that enthusiasm. And if anything, we get inspired each week by the people and what they're doing, and how they bring all the skills that they might have gotten, and not just skills, but like emotional skills,
Yeah.
things that
Mm,
they
mm.
they get from collaborating with their friends around a table and storytelling that informs their lives in various different ways. And that's the thing that I think I was most surprised when we were going and looking at researching this book, was just how many people become better people because they play Dungeons and Dragons.
Right.
And so it's so refreshing to be like, oh yeah, we work on something that improves people's lives,
Isn't
like
it nice to think
objectively.
about for
Yay.
once?
Yes.
I
Yes.
mean, because D&D for me is like, and I'll say this because it's also a Magic podcast. D&D reminds me a lot of the same stuff that I bring to Magic is what I took from D&D, which is I want to be telling a story. I want to be collaborating. I want to be in a group setting with my friends, building, a shared kind of universe together. And like when I play Commander with my buddies, that's kind of what we're doing. We've got this universe that we've built up that we're telling stories organically through our play. I mean, I started playing D&D in 1989, so I've been around and done this for a long time. And for me, the thing is like when I was growing up in Massachusetts, and like I was one of like 3 brown kids in the entire state apparently. And you know, like it's a place where there's such little diversity that the white people were dividing themselves into like Italians and Irish and Pilgrims, and I'm like, y'all look the same to me. So, uh, but but the thing is, like, I remember in like my 5th grade being introduced to Dungeons and Dragons via the Dragons of Autumn Twilight that my friend Hari, the other brown kid in school, introduced me to. And then
Aw.
he's like, "Hey, you know what? There's a game attached to this." And I'm like, "What?" And we went to his house. He had the Tales of the Lance box set. I rolled up my first Dragonlance character, Red Robe Mage, because I don't know why would any Dragonlance player want to be a Red Robe. And then we got to explore, and I was like, "Holy crap! I get to be the hero."
Mhm.
Now, in the 80s and early 90s, and heck, let's say in the entire era of my life until about like 2015, people like me were not heroes in Western mythology, in Western cultural mythology and pop culture in our storytelling.
Yeah.
Like we were the Haji to your Johnny Quest, right? Like so in D&D, giving me the empowering ability to be the hero, to be the lead of my own story, and being able to, I read a thing on Twitter yesterday, which I thought was the most like heart stabbing thing I've ever seen, which is a therapist goes and talks to their client and says, "Okay, tell me about your OC, your original character." And the player does. And then they're like, "Aha, I know all of your
I've
insecurities
read
now."
that
I
too.
saw that
And
too.
it was just like, and I thought about that for a second. I'm like, let me think. What was my first character? Let's see. It was a half elf who really felt insecure both in his homeland and in the shared land that he was living in now, who cut his ears to try to fit in with all the other
Oh,
people. And really, I'm like, holy crap, I just wanted to be a white kid as a kid really,
oh,
really badly. And it's right there in my little character. And I'm like, oh my God, D&D gives you that tool to explore who you want to be and gives you that ability to be that person and then to take that back to reality where the
Mhm.
rest of us can come back and be like, if I'm that confident when I'm fighting against Nazgul, I can be that confident when I'm talking to my boss about getting a raise, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's
That's so funny, Shivam, because similarly, I mean, obviously we have very different backgrounds and have a very different upbringing. But my first character was also a half elf who was uncomfortable in the situation. I'm obviously inspired also by
yeah,
Kenneth's half elven, of course.
right.
Uh, but it's I think I came from that, from having a very Catholic upbringing, from having this love of fantasy and wanting to delve into it more, but not being able to embrace it fully, as well as being a theater kid who's more outspoken in my public sphere, but not being able to do that at home, not being able to kind of be my true self where I was
Yeah,
growing up, right? And so it's so great because this game can let the two of us who had completely different, actual experiences, but kind of end up in the same place and have the
right.
same almost therapeutic epiphany once we unpack all of that first character stuff.
I mean, it's wild to think about because, like, every time someone's like, "Oh yeah, what characters?" I'm like, "I play a paladin or a cleric." And it's like, "Huh? Wonder why, Mister Hindu priest justice guy." I'm like, "Well, look." It's like I have two friends who are Lutheran pastors who play a lot of like Diablo and D&D and stuff. And I was like, "Aren't you not supposed to do this? Isn't this like satanic for you?" It's like, "What could be more Christian than going and killing Satan every week?" And I was like, "Fair. You got
Yeah,
me there.
right.
Fair."
Right?
Now, yeah, go ahead, Charlie, you were saying?
Oh, no, I
Yeah, it's
totally
like
agree with
it's
that
funny though.
statement.
It's like um it's just it's wild like the games that Watsi puts out for all of whatever that I complain about regularly, the thing that you guys do so well is give people a reason to congregate, a reason to get together, to explore themselves, to understand who they are, to express their identity, either through their character, through their deck building, through, the stories that we want to tell about each other with each other. And you give disparate people from all over the place a reason to be able to have a shared experience. And
Mhm.
when you have that shared experience in a game, you can go out to the real world and be like, "Oh, you know what? I can interact with other humans again too."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I
It's
mean,
it's celebrated. Like, you want to have a diverse party of
yeah,
people to
exactly.
play with. We celebrate each other's differences in D&D.
I mean, think about how bad it would be if you didn't have a rogue in your party, right? Like we're all just walking into that rope trap every week.
Yep.
Now, it was weird though, like the first time I went to Gen Con and it's just me in Wisconsin and to everybody else. It's like I think somebody said like, "Dude, you're like an Oreo floating in a bowl of milk." And I'm like, "That is wild." It
Wow.
was so funny and true. It's gotten a lot better though. I went to Gen Con this year and I was like, "Holy crap, there's like women and there's like people of every race and ethnicity. There's like people of every gender. They've got their pronouns on the thing. There's trans folk living happy lives. It was weirdly idyllic, and I was like, this is what we fought for. This is
Mhm.
Yeah.
what we have tried to come to.
And we
Um,
talk about that a lot in the book, actually, in Welcome to
yeah.
Dragon Talk.
When is it
The
coming out?
actual It's coming out December 5th. I'll do a quick little bit about that. You can pre-order it now through the University of Iowa Press, online booksellers, or even better, go into your local bookstore and tell them that you want this book, and hopefully they'll order more than one copy and stock it on the shelves if you do that.
Mhm.
But so I have an ulterior motive, but also it is really cool to support all of your local bookstores as much as possible. But that was actually a really important part of writing this book for me was realizing that this community has grown, and you had
Mm.
mentioned since 2015. That's when I started at the working for Wizards. Coincidentally, it was also the first week that Critical Role began streaming on
Mm.
Twitch, and then everything expanded and grew from there. And people got to see other people play Dungeons and Dragons, and it wasn't just that's the stereotypical thing that you saw all the time. People got to see different faces and different. And then once we realized that was a thing, that the stereotype of the socially awkward kid playing in their basement, we got to dispel that. Then we got to be like, as you were saying, like
Dispel.
bringing, yeah, yeah, right. We got counterspell on that one, and realize that there was something that we could do to bring, people with different colored skin, from different backgrounds, from different
Mhm, mhm.
sexual orientations and sexual identities and gender identities, and bring them in and be like, look, this is something for everyone. It doesn't matter who you are. You're going to be able to explore and find something within this game, probably in a way that you might not have expected,
Mm.
right? And so many of the people that we have spoken to were about opening up their eyes to all of those things, as well as, and it's implied, the people at the table with them being able to
Yeah.
experience their stories and their lives, and develop some empathy for them. And I think I mean it when I say people who play Dungeons and Dragons at this point in history are better people, because they have all of these skills. They are able to be understanding that having a diverse party is successful. And that's true in life. It's true in everything. And so, yeah, we certainly do not shy away from the fact that there might have been points in the D&D community history in which that was less so, but it has grown and changed and shifted, and we're proud to show that kind of that storyline throughout this book.
Yeah, like we can talk about like Oriental adventures and deities and demigods sometime. Let me share my thoughts with you. But it's just
For sure.
it's like so interesting to me that when I was growing up, like D&D was definitely like white male dude, awkward teenager, polo shirts and pen protectors. I mean, it was the 80s, right? Like we know,
Right,
you know
right.
the
Having
stereotype,
the
ET,
having
right?
the
Yep.
tape between the
Right, exactly.
eyeglasses.
All of the things, and they were all true. It was weird. It was weird,
It was
but
a
like
weird time. And that's
it,
why I mean maybe Shelly could talk a little bit about like that experience and then how it changed for you, right?
How the what experience being
being in the
in
80s
the 80s?
when
No,
we were young.
the thought of what D&D was before you
Oh,
got to
yeah.
experience it.
No, totally. That was I as a kid, I don't think I knew for sure that there were people playing Dungeons& and Dragons. I'm pretty sure that I just weaponized it as, like, "I don't you're a nerd, and you probably play D&D." I don't know for sure. However, there were
But it's
2
very high likely.
it's highly possible, and that when my first book came out, Confessions of a Part-Time Sorceress, one of those gentlemen that are, highly successful, wonderful people now, who we are Facebook friends, he wrote to me and he was like, "Oh, really? You
Now it's
write
okay.
you're writing books about Dungeons& and Dragons, and you used to make fun of me and whatever for playing it." I'm like, "I don't remember making fun
Get
of
wrecked.
you."
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm really sorry. Like, I wish you guys invited me to play because it was awesome. But when I was hired at Wizards, way, way back when, I was hired to work on Magic. That
Mm,
was my first experience, and I didn't know I didn't play Magic. I was hired because I had promotions experience, and I aced my interview.
mm.
And then they're like, "Here's this game," and I thought, "What? Huh? Like, I don't understand how cards attack each other. Like, this is weird. What's happening?" I was at the company for probably 4 weeks, really trying to learn this game, and it was time to go to Gen Con. So they sent me off to Gen Con, and I had a very similar experience that you did going to Gen Con, where I was like, "Oh my god, like this is like a little slice of heaven for the gamers." Like
Yeah,
there is nowhere in the world where this many people can come together and just let it all
where
hang
everybody
out.
wants to hear about your PC.
Everybody wants to hear about
Yeah.
your character. Everybody wants to play games with you. You can just walk through the hotel lobbies and you're like, "That looks interesting. Well, come sit down, join
Right?
us, and learn a new
So
game." And it was
good.
like
It's like
it was
Nirvana.
it was nerd nirvana. I think we've even used that term in this book, actually, when we were talking about
We
Gen
have
Con.
described it that way.
I think we actually did describe it that way, but, the whole time I was at Wizards, I had worked on many different brands, but not D&D, and that was okay with me because I really thought that D&D was just not gonna be my jam.
You can't work at WotC and then say, "Gee, D&D is too nerdy for me."
I
But
did
she did.
though, but
She
I
did.
did. And it wasn't so much like I mean, I knew some of the D&D people, I'm like, "They seem nice," but I felt like not just, like, the nerdiness, I felt like it's probably too complicated for me, and
Mm,
I'm not really a fantasy fan, so
sure.
what's
Oh,
in it for me?
well,
And I would go into conference rooms after D&D games were played, and I saw their weird little maps still on the whiteboards, and I saw their weird little words that I'm like, "Who can even pronounce this? What is this?" And it was like, "Yeah, this isn't there's too many consonants in that to actually be a word. I'm not playing D&D." And what's with all the dice in the different shapes, and I think they probably all speak with weird accents, and they're it's just not for
guilty.
me.
Yeah,
So,
right.
and then I did get a job kind of on the D&D team in the publishing department. I was working on children's novels, and it became clear at some point, I guess, to my boss that, uh, that new brand manager doesn't know how to play D&D, so we might have to make her. And she was like, "Yeah, you should really play. There's a dungeon master who's gonna teach you and a few other people how to play D&D." And I was like, "Oh, no, they found me. They're coming for me. They're
Get wrecked.
coming for me." And after it took, in my memory, it feels like days to create a character, but it was probably like an hour, whatever. It was
Creating your first
3.5.
character is incredibly difficult, though.
It
It's
was
like
so well, this was like,
Late
paper,
era.
pencil, and dice.
You
It was
mean
late
now?
era
We didn't have
It's still
3.5
the
paper,
too,
pencil, and
so
dice, thank
3
you.
oh, for okay. Keeping it real. Keeping it real.
None
Um,
of this newfangled for me,
no.
thank you.
Well, this was like it was a long time, and after we were done creating my character, he gave me my mini, and I was like, "Oh, I kinda love this character. This might be fun." And when we went off on our very first adventure, and it was just meant to be a one-off
Tell me you
because
died.
I didn't die.
Damn it.
But
That would've been so
I
funny.
like 5 minutes in, I was like, "Oh god, they were right. They've been right this whole time. This game actually is really fun, and I can see why people like it." Even a person who doesn't gravitate towards fantasy, a person who, much to Greg's dismay, watches The Bachelor and likes to, get paint my nails and, go do all these really stereotypical, not, like, what people didn't think D&D players did. I do. I still do those things, and I play D&D, and I am here to say this is a game for everyone. There is something in it for everyone.
I mean, it's hard to shift a culture though. And
yeah,
that's one of the big problems that I've noticed, especially in like we see this in Magic, we see this in D&D a lot, is that there's people who grew up with a certain era with a certain mindset, and D&D, like these fantasy games are huge tents. They're epic tents. We've got infinite room in here for everybody. Like if I exist and if me and my friend are playing a queer campaign or whatever it is, it's not going to take away from your campaign. It's not going to change
Right.
the canon. The books are all there. If you
additive.
prefer Ed Greenwood's original versions of Forgotten Realms, they still exist. You
Yes.
still have them. And
Yes.
like it's just we run into this with Dragonlance too, because like when I was working on the new Dragonlance novel, I was going to like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman, and I'm like, we need to make some radical cool changes to fit, modern day. I want people today to experience the same hope and joy that I got out of your novels when I was a kid. And there were some changes that they were totally down with, and some that they were let's say maybe this was too close to home and they didn't want to change. And I was like, that's fair. I get it. But one of the reactions I got when I was posting about these books from fandom is like, people like, you touched these novels. I'm going to hunt you down. I'm like, bro,
Ugh.
your books are still there. I
Yeah,
have the same books on my shelf. They haven't changed. The words in there didn't magically become social justice words. They were always social justice words. But but it's really silly because like it's so weird to go and take when you see like an all black group of people playing D&D and D and streaming, and then you're like, "Oh, how dare you?" And I'm like, "Bro, there's 10,000 people streaming D&D. Let them live. This is
yeah,
fine. The more of us there are, the more of us there'll be. The more of us there'll be, the more people we have to play with. The more people we have to play with, the more people will be incentivized to make us more things that we can play with. Come on, this is only simple. It's just it's if we
totally.
want math, having a bigger market is better for all of us. D&D is open for everybody. Shut the hell up and sit down and just enjoy your game. It's fine."
It's true. Yeah, no, and I think that became a tenet of Dragon Talk from that point, in 2015 when we were like, at first we latched onto the
When did you
ideas.
start it and when did you start the show?
Well, that's a good question.
Mhm.
It
Shady memories. We don't
Yeah, we
know.
had to go back and research. The RSS feed that we're currently on began actually with Acquisitions Incorporated. It was the first
Ah,
time that it started with James Wyatt, and then Chris. I always say that because nobody
I love
remembers that
James
James
Wyatt.
Wyatt started it.
He's great.
And then Chris Perkins took over those audio walkthroughs of the folks from Penny Arcade playing Dungeons and Dragons. That's where the RSS podcast feed for Dragon Talk began. It morphed. It changed a few times over the years. Some of the designers took over and wanted to talk about mechanics and rules and their development. And then a little bit before my time, Shelly and Bart Carroll took it over, and we're doing some interviews, some design discussions, a little bit more haphazard, I guess, in the schedule.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
not a weekly or biweekly, or even when there was no regular schedule when it
Nope.
happened.
It was
Um,
arbitrary.
but
Yes.
I came from the game journalism side of like content.
Mhm.
And so when I joined in 2015, we tell this story in the book. Shelly
Weren't
just
you at
kind of
The
was like,
Escapist before?
yeah, I was the EIC there at the end when it all crashed and burned. Um, luckily, I was able to find a job at Wizards because I loved talking about D&D. Always pitch stories about role-playing games and tabletop as much as possible. Finally got to do more of that while the Escapist was there. And then because I was brand new at Wizards, Shelly was like, "Hey, we're gonna go record a podcast. Do you want to come?" And my little puppy dog eyes was like, "Yeah, please. I want to do something. I want to be a part of I want to be a part of your world." That first episode I was on, we had 4 hosts and I think 1 guest. It was
If
a little bit,
even, we might not have even had a guest.
it was a bit
the old
odd.
days of 4 guys talking into a box.
Yes.
Good days of podcasts.
But people's jobs shifted and changed. Trevor Kidd was a big part of that back then, as well as Bart Carroll.
I remember Trevor.
His job shifted a little bit, and then it became just me and Shelly. And I was like, let's do this every week. Let's rebrand. Let's not just call it, because I think it was the official
D&D
Dungeons and Dragons podcast was the name of it in the feed. And we're like, let's call it Dragon Talk, and let's get some branding out there and kind of, open up the net a little bit of the people that we are talking to. We had only done, I think, no call-ins. People had only done in-person recording, and so I was like, we need to do call-ins because people are not going to travel up to Seattle to be guests. And that, honestly, in 2015, that was a bit of new technology. We had to figure out some jiggery pokery to make that work. It was not
Skypey,
easy.
Probably
it was Skype. It was Skype at first. Actually, older episodes, you can actually hear the Skype calling
it's
sound.
So annoying. There's a reason I use Zencaster now instead of Skype, let me tell you. But
it is much better. And so, and then once we were able to be like, oh, we need content, we need weekly content, then we're like, there's so many folks out there who play Dungeons and Dragons. And that was around the time where like folks like Joe Manganiello, Matthew Lillard, later on Deborah Ann Wall, we were able to invite them. And they said yes. That was what was crazy. It was like, people were like, yeah, I want to talk about this. They were okay with it. And I think that, in addition to streaming beginning to be a much bigger thing in the world, and the us as being the official Dungeons and Dragons podcast, talking to all these people and bringing them in is what kind of shifted that culture slowly but surely over time, so that it became. And again, we do also talk about this in the book. There was one interview in particular when I talked to Tanya DePass around 2016.
Tanya is amazing.
She is amazing, and I had no idea. I followed her from the video game side of things. We talked a lot about Dragon Age. We interacted on Twitter back and forth about that. And then she live tweeted a talk that she was at with Jeremy Crawford about the 2014 Player's Handbook, and how excited she was that the depiction of a human fighter was a Black woman. And then she was, kind of, oh, this is great. Maybe I'll go back to D&D. Like, she'd had some not great experiences with it before. And so she was like, all right, maybe I'll go back in it. So I brought her on the podcast to talk about that. And that interview opened my eyes. It really did. It was like a little bit like, we don't have to be on the sidelines. There was a small choice that I could make and Shelly could make to not just not exclude, but to include, to bring people in and talk through and hear their stories and show that it is not, it's not like a diversity panel where just like, so tell me about how much your life sucks. It is just like, oh, you're nerds, you're dorks, you're just like us. Tell us your stories.
Yes.
And if some of the background information about what it was like growing up in that way comes out, sure. But it was never about like, the trauma type interviews. It was a celebratory.
I hate those so much. I mean,
I did too. And so it was nice to bring that shift. And I think over time, as we did a little bit more with the marketing of bringing in Rivals of Waterdeep with Tanya and other folks, just to show the breadth of this community, I think that's what actually did end up shifting the culture over time.
Yeah, and then we get things like Radiant Citadel, which is like the first book of all minority writers and stuff. And I'm like, this is so sweet. Like, I never would have imagined something like that existing when I was a kid, right? Like, what the best we had was like Sri Raji, the random friggin' Ravenloft like domain that had tigers with their hands backwards. Let me tell you something, and you guys are D&D people, so you're gonna hear my rant for a second. Rakshasas are not tigers with their hands backwards. Gygax made that up out of friggin' nowhere, and it has pissed me off for like 40 years that this exists as a weird stereotype. Like, ooh, look, they're backward tiger. I'm like, no, dude. Rakshas just literally means like demon. They're basically just magic users, shapeshifter. They're a legitimate cultural part of Hindu culture. And so when I was like, oh wow, they're Rakshasas, what are they? What the hell is this? Where do you even get that from? Are you kidding me?
Probably from a toy. That's
Yes,
what we figured
that's
out, is that a
where
lot of the
the
monsters just
rust
came from a
monster,
toy
yeah.
that he had on his desk or
It's
bought at a
so God, dude.
store.
The one time I got to meet Gyjax was not the shining moment of my life, let me tell you. Um, I'm glad that we have moved past certain generations of D&D, let's just say.
Yeah.
I think that now it is better than it was. It
Mhm.
was once upon a time not welcoming to people like me. Even but the thing is though, and I don't want to it's weird. This is a podcast about you. It's not about me. However, being
It's your
stories of
podcast.
D&D, it's a thing that we just end up I share the things that changed my life and D&D impacted my life greatly. So this is one of those things. It's just that when I've never dealt with overt racism in D&D, but there's always been that undercurrent has been there. And
Yeah.
it's just been like weirdly niche and like kind of like our game is full or like you get all these weird kind of like cues and stuff that you start to understand. I'm like, is it? It's D&D. There's infinite room. Um but one thing that like for instance, the rise of streaming is one of
Yeah.
those things that I could not understand because, like, listening to people play D&D is weird for me because that brings me back to those times when I wasn't allowed, right? Like,
Mm.
when
Oh,
I had to
man.
sit and, like,
Interesting.
I'm in the game club and I'm doing something else, but I don't get to play in the D&D group because they said no because reasons, and it was just like, that's a weird I realize that not everybody's got a very specific niche experience but that why it's very hard for me to sit and listen to other people play because 'cause I'm like, "Oh, I don't wanna do that anymore. I can tell my own stories now."
That's a
But
generational thing. I've kind
yeah,
of realized, maybe we're of a similar generation in that I would much rather play a
yeah,
game than listen to
Yeah.
people play a game.
yeah, it's kind like, I mean, I'll watch a lot of streams about Magic or about, like, other Nintendo games and stuff because, like, I don't know why D&D is different. Maybe it's just a personal trigger for me. But what I found fascinating, though, is because of streaming, so many cultures, so many subcultures, so many different groups of people have been able to come up and do really cool D&D stories and share these really cool, like, narratives that you wouldn't get otherwise, and I think that right now we're living in a weird golden age of D&D. It feels
Yeah.
like this is more accepted than it's ever been. It's more widespread. Millions of people watch freaking Critical Role. Like it's not my favorite thing in the world. Like I've tried and it's just not for me. That's fine. There's a lot of critters out there and God bless them. May they enjoy themselves. But it's just cool. It's so cool to be living in a world where D&D is not only okay, but is like the thing to do.
Mhm. There's on our way to school today, I have a 9-year-old, and my husband and I are starting the D&D club at his elementary school
Yeah, I've
in
been teaching my
January.
8-year-old to play too, so I understand.
Yeah, so I don't remember, he was probably being a wise ass, and he said something about D&D or magic, and I said, "Yeah, well, you just wait and see how cool you become when your friends realize that your parents are starting the D&D club." And my husband was like my husband goes, "A sentence that would never have been spoken when I was a child." Like, none of that could actually be cool. And it's like, I was, giving him a hard time, but part of that actually is going to be true because his friends will discover magic. They will discover D&D, and unlike when you were playing D&D as kids in the 70s, 80s, early 90s, whatever, it's encouraged. It's now there are your teachers might actively be trying to get you to play Dungeons and Dragons
Mhm.
because they realize there's some real great learning associations
It's
with the
good for team
game,
building, it's good for development of social cues and understanding.
especially after these past 2.5 years.
When they
Mhm.
Kids
all went
need it
feral.
more than ever. Yes, and they don't know how to interact with each other again, and yeah, so
Yeah.
it's a much different world, definitely.
Totally. And I think the main difference there with streaming that has changed the culture has been something that I didn't, it took a while for me to grok, which is that experience that you had of like wanting to go into the game store or whatever and join a game. Even if you were able to join that game, maybe it wasn't your style of play. Maybe it wasn't the thing that you
Right.
Mhm.
were thinking of when you thought of D&D. Before there was a streaming or a culture around it, you might have just been like, okay, Dungeons and Dragons isn't for me.
Yep.
That's it. The entire D&D experience, based on that one thing, that's all you could have. But now with streaming, people are able to realize that there are different styles out there. There's folks who like the fact that focus on tactics. There's folks who like to do more role play. There's people who like horror that over things, and right. And so if people have an experience that they don't like, they just be like, okay, well, I'll try something different. I won't just bounce off D&D as a whole. I'll bounce off that particular style or that DM or that group for whatever reason and find the group that they want. And I think that has changed everything, because it allowed people to find that ideal game group out there, and know that there is an ideal game group out there.
Yeah. Before I shift us off topic for a second, I just want to bring up that recently there was a Kickstarter called Desi Quest, which was put on by Sandeep Parekh, who is he's like an actor. He was on Felicia Day's show with that Xbox. I forget what it was called, but the weird nerd thing that everybody watched.
The Guild.
The Guild.
Oh, yeah,
thank you. Yeah, like that we all watched in the early 2000s when it was the first thing that we could see.
Because it was making fun of WoW, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it was like, yeah, and like really just all of gaming culture in general.
Yeah.
But the weird thing is, I used to go to his house for when I lived in Massachusetts for like Friday prayer meetings with his dad would basically like host these little prayer gatherings at their house, and we used to go and like do this. And I'm like, dude, it is wild to me that I'm one of the biggest names in Magic, and he's like becoming this up and coming like nerd star because of the Guild, because of this new highly successful Kickstarter, which is like all Indian people playing role-playing games together. And I'm like, what the hell, man? When we were kids, we were the only ones, and this is like amazing that it's brought you here. Like, I don't know, I'm so as like one of the things I like to say is like all of those hits that I took as a kid, all the weird like racial things, and all the nerds are very, very mean when they want to be, and like all of those things I took trying to be a fantasy nerd as a kid in a place that I didn't belong led to a point where people today can just be nerds of whatever they want to be. And I'm like, you know what, man, that's a win. Every one of those hits we took as kids to get to a point where people can just express themselves and be themselves is worthwhile now. Cause like I can see this, and it just feels like up the street from me, there's this con called Big Bad Con or something going on in San Francisco this weekend. And in it, one of the things they did, Ajit George, who was the person behind Radiant Citadel, he hosted an entire panel of POC, like people within gaming and streaming, within indie role playing, within D&D, and got them all together to have huge meet and greet and like a mixer, basically like the biggest collection of like Indian people or like South Asians playing D&D together.
We talked about that on Dragon Talk, and
I'm just like, what the hell?
Yeah.
That group, I think when they did it right before the pandemic was when first Big Bad Con was. Many of the people in that room, in that meet and greet, became writers on Radiant Citadel.
It's amazing. It's, to me, it's like, it feels so satisfying and fulfilling to know that we've come so far, right? Like it's so validating to like all those years of me sitting there and reading like Dragonlance novels, in secret, and being like, someday.
And then to turn it, back to the book again, like I hope that this book is a guide. Welcome to Dragon Talk is a guide to getting people into this community, right? So if you have seen some of the tweets from you about Dungeons and Dragons, or will watch Stranger Things and be like, oh, that game seems fun, maybe I want to join that, and are interested. I like to say, D&D
so I wanted to ask you
curious.
Specifics about the book now.
Like, go for
who's in it? Who did you interview? What did you? Can you tell us what the book actually is? Sorry, I got involved. I got talking about D&D. I don't get to talk about D&D very often these days. When my child was born, my wife and I used to play, and we had a group. And 4th edition killed my group. And then my kid was born, and we killed our time. And then now it's like I play Magic, and now that's my time. But
that's so funny. I mentioned that in the book too, how 4th edition kind of was like, oh yeah, that ended that.
Look, 3rd edition and 4th edition are both phenomenal games that are meant for very different purposes. And 3rd edition was very good for character customization, for storytelling, for building things. 4th edition is the best tactical role-playing game I've ever played for like miniature combat and things. But if you move from Storyland to Tactics Land and you're not prepared for that, your group dies.
Right.
That's all I got to say about that.
Well, back to the book, back to what's in the book, because we keep getting sidetracked.
Sorry.
Which is what I do all the time.
I have a talking podcast. What do you want?
That's what it works. No, I believe it. But we want people to pick this up and be get those references that you just made, Shivam, because people who don't have the history with the community might not know anything that what you just said about fourth and third and the growth of the community. So that's what we started off with: is what is D&D? How do you play it? We have our same jokey casual style, so it's not like this is how you play. It's like, how do you explain something that is unexplainable to someone? And we try to do that for about 3 or 4 pages, and then we get into the history of Dungeons and Dragons community, not necessarily like John Peterson giving us the the ins and the outs of how TSR was formed. It was more about, which is interesting if you're that type of scholar, but this is more just like what you need to know for context for all of the interviews and essays on the interviews that we include in the latter part of the book. And it goes through everything that you're just mentioning, from the 70s, the 80s to 90s to the growth of being like internet famous in the D&D community, how that was a thing. Everybody had DM Watson summon in their handles, which was really exciting. I know many of them out there, and there's some of the people I interact with a lot still on Twitter. And then Shelly goes into more detail on her history, as well as like the growth of the D&D podcast itself, right?
Yeah. Yes. That so sketchy memories where we had to go back and say, how did this whole thing start? How did this happen?
And then the rest of the book is 29 different essays that Shelly and I both write. I write one, she writes one, and we go back and forth that way. From stories from the 300 plus episodes that we have had since we started doing this all together, and some of them before we started doing it together, about stories that touched us, that had interesting things going on. Like, so we mentioned Joe Manganiello. There's one on him. Matthew Lillard is actually one of the first ones in the book.
Beetle and Grimm's is really cool.
Yes.
Just gonna say, the fact that the hackers guy is making super sweet magic and D&D stuff is kind of wild to me.
It's so, I know, it's mind-boggling. And that he played for 20 years. Like, he played like back in 91 is, I think, when he started.
It's his gaming group that he's
his same
formed a
gaming
company
group.
with, which I think is,
I mean, if you're going to, right?
amazing.
Like,
it's so great. Oh, speaking of which, we have to get back to them, Shelly. And then we talked to the psychologists that have used Dungeons and Dragons in their practices. We talked to educators who have used D&D.
State senators.
State Senator Steve Hobbs, who is now the Secretary of State for Washington State, which is mind-boggling to me as well. Folks like Tanya, folks like Omega Jones, who talks about bards and being a musical theater kid growing up, and how important. He had a similar kind of, I don't really like D&D. I don't think I'm going to like it. And then when he played, he just latched onto it so much and got so much wonderful creative outflow from it, as well as being a voice during many of the upheavals during 2020 and that was
2020.
Important. Yeah, right. And in many ways, this is a pandemic book. We wrote it from September 2020, I think.
A lot of time on your hands.
Turned it in 2021. So we also have a story here from which is one of my favorite essays, from Rufus Hound, who is a actor and a D&D player from the UK, and how he'd always wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons, but by his admission said he wasn't smart enough to figure out how to turn a book into a game, even with his kids and the starter sets that were available out there. And when all of his work as an entertainer dried up during the pandemic, he's like, I'm going to start on this weekly streaming show from someone I met at a wedding. And the absolutely captivating story he told about how his character and the piece of artwork that he was creating, he wrote a song that his character sang based on an experience he had in the game, and how it unlocked something similar to what we were talking about earlier, about a character can talk about your insecurities and deepest held thoughts. He said he had so many layers between him when he finally realized what he was actually feeling and experiencing. It was, we were laughing, and then all of a sudden in the interview, all three of us were crying. Huge tears, because it was this emotional release that you really only get from something like this, something like D&D, where you have this shared experience with people around a table. And so that's just some of the snippets. I don't know, are there any that I missed, Shelly, that you wanted to highlight?
There's, well, obviously, we talked to some writers, map makers, a gentleman who worked with the Girl Scouts that created a
Mm.
TRPG badge for girls, based on playing Dungeons on an RPG workshop, a teacher at an all-girls middle school that, continues to have a thriving D&D, club. That's one of my favorite stories, especially when the girls were graduating, going to high school, a co-ed high school, and they were so worried because they were gonna have to let boys in their D&D club.
How dare.
Yeah, and they're like, "Oh,
Boys
I
aren't
guess
allowed to play
boys can play
D&D.
too. I don't
Yeah, they were
know."
like, "It's okay, boys should be allowed to play too." Like, "Oh, this is amazing." We talked to maybe you saw a news story about, Robert Wardaw, who had his, the same D&D game running for, at the time, 38 years. I think by the time this book comes out, it'll be like 42 years. But he's super inspiring, and like just getting to like the heart of why he has continued this game for so long is super touching. And it's just B. Dave Walters, who is, a hero to all of us, of course, has to be part of this, and just a huge part of the D&D community. It ended up just really feeling like a love letter to the D&D community and to all of the people that have graced us with their time and their talents on Dragon Talk, and just really hopefully conveying how important this game is to Greg and I, but to all of these people too.
That sounds rad. That sounds really, really cool because, like, D&D is definitely one of those feast or famine things. It's, like, deeply impactful to your life, either in, like, the most glowing way or, like, deeply miserable. Like, I've known people who've had some awful experiences with D&D, and
We
it's it's a hard to get past some of those, and
Mm.
it's like when they grow up and when they finally are like, "You know what? I'm gonna approach this game on my own terms and take it back for myself." That's, like, such a warming feeling. It's such a, like, thank you for reclaiming yourself, right? Like,
Yeah,
and then they can go back and they can enjoy this thing that they enjoyed without the traumas that they experienced earlier, because sometimes when you give young teenage men control, bad things happen.
Yeah,
And D&D is like the first time a lot of DMs get to be in charge of something, and
right.
if they don't have the right discipline, then we end up with trouble. Um,
true. And funnily enough, there is a one in here from Dr. Michael Mallon, who's a psychologist, the id DM, and he talks about how his brother, older brother, very similar to Billy from Stranger Things, was kind of like a metalhead, but also really popular. And his life did not go the way that he intended, and ended up taking his own life. And it was really hard for us to have this interview because we were like, we're, as you're saying, like, we're about celebrating D&D, we're talking about like the
yeah,
positive aspects, this might be a really tough subject. And Michael Mallon was like, I want that discussion. It's important for us to talk about these difficult things
yeah,
and to bring that up, because it's important. You can't just sweep it under the rug and think everything is going to be okay when people are hurting like that. And so that was a really important part where we were like, I think that one's even called battling in real life demons, IRL
Yeah.
demons, because
yeah. I mean,
you can sometimes not. You're right. Have that, and he was a fourth edition player. He's done a lot of stuff around then, but then also jumped into Dungeons and Dragons after that. It was something that he shared with his older brother, and that he is able to use more in a cathartic way and reclaim it, just like you're saying.
yeah.
Yeah, really powerful.
But then, like, at the same time, I get to see my son play Spellthor the Wizard and go through and zap things, and I'm like, "Damn, dude, if I had known as a kid that I would get to watch my own kid play
Right?
D&D while I'm running it, that's like
It's pretty special.
that's the nerd dream right there, right? Like,
It's
that's
joy,
where we made it."
joy in a bottle, right there.
Oh my god,
Yeah.
it's so good. I don't know, I just like, I love D&D. Like, it's deeply, deeply impactful to me, and for a long time, it just felt like the love I was giving to this game, like D&D and Magic both, I was like, I love this, and it's not being reciprocated. And when it is, it's real bad. Like when Kaladesh came out with the Magic set, and I was like, y'all took my culture for wallpaper and left me outside. And I'm like, this is D&D all
Oof.
over again. But now it feels like these lessons have been taken to heart and are starting to be breaking through, and we're starting to get a D&D that welcomes the audience that plays it and is written for the audience that plays it, as opposed to the audience that they wanted to have playing it, or they thought like it felt like, and it felt like D&D for a long time was written for a very specific person, and that the rest of us who found it and made it our own did it kind of as an off-brand, like off-label usage of this medication. But now it feels like you guys have realized, oh, this audience is much, much bigger than Pocket Protectors. And now we need to make this game represent all of these people. How can we do that? And it feels like we're coming to a place where I can say that that's a thing that's happening. And
That's the
that's really,
goal.
really
Hope
cool.
That
so.
is absolutely the goal, right? I mean, I think that's also what's important to note is that there were people who were trying even back then, and and failing, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
but like I think it's something that we are always going to struggle with, and as a culture, are struggle with, and are
Oh, yeah.
growing and changing and shifting. I think now the intention is there, but it's also there's I mean like. I can't speak for anyone on the Magic team about your specific criticisms around some of the things, but I'm sure it was never to do what you're saying. I think it
They've
was.
heard.
Yes, I know. Yes, but I think each one of those times where it was the intention, I mean, intentions are great, but the learning is there now. I think
Mm,
people are really excited about that and realizing that there's steps along the way, there's growth, there's change in every single facet of our lives, from the brands to the game design that we're talking about to the podcast itself. Like I was saying, like
yeah.
I didn't really understand inclusion again until that conversation with Tanya was like, oh my gosh, this is great, we should do this more.
It
And it
turns
was a
out if you
small.
have a platform, centering people is a really powerful thing you can do.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's what we actively have chosen to do going forward. And I think that is uh what a microcosm of what's happening in the D&D
Mm,
and gaming communities as a whole, is that things are
Mhm.
going to a
yeah.
good place. There might be ups and downs and falters along
We're in
the
a
way.
transitory period right now.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah,
getting there, but we'll get there, I think.
for sure.
And so as we bring this ship to a close, I was hoping, and my listeners get grumpy if I don't talk about Magic for a few minutes. So can I ask you both what your experience with my beloved card game has been?
I love Magic. Shelly, you want to jump in first? Or do you want me to do it?
Mine's really short. Well, as I said, when I started at Wizards,
When did you work on Magic?
1999.
Holy crap! That was a long time ago.
It's a really long time ago.
Wow.
And I was utterly fascinated by this game. Like I said, like I don't understand why cards would attack each other, but okay. Um,
See,
really, what?
if you had been like me and learned D&D first, you'd be like,
Then
"Whoa,
it
they're
would have
throwing
made
fireballs
sense.
at dragons.
I
I
know.
understand that."
Yeah, I've never been good at Magic. I made honestly, I could possibly say I don't know that I've ever won a game of Magic. So this whole thing at Gen Con, because they were like sending me to teach people how to
Oh,
play
jeez.
Magic, and I like barely know how to do it myself.
I
And
think you turn this one this way.
I had all these kids, like mostly kids, come back to the booth day after day, and they were like, "That's her, like beat her." Like they just were like every day there would
It's
be
a
like
training
10 more
dummy.
of them. Like,
Oh yeah,
God, really?
you're the
They were just
giant
like,
rats in the basement. You're like,
there
kill
would be
them and level up.
like actual like D and
That's
D.
exactly it.
Actually, like Magic R&D guys were like, "We'll teach you." They're like, "No, we want her." They just wanted to like
Like,
pound me.
kick the
Like,
stuffing out of
how?
this.
Yep. Like, how quickly can we take her down?
In
Like this
1999, that's like
game.
Urza's block. That's like
Yeah.
broken Magic too.
Yeah.
God, they
Yeah.
taught you at like the most miserable time of the
It
game.
was so hard. It was so
Oh my
hard.
god. It's
Yes.
gotten better.
It's well, and I do appreciate it. I appreciate the game design, the strategy, the people who are really good at it. I love the art. My son again is, starting to not starting to. He was always seemed like into Magic as much as we're like D&D, D&D. He's like it's just throwing him into the arms of Magic.
Well, what your parents do is dorky and uncool.
Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, we have to, stop talking about D&D. But I haven't played in a very long time, but maybe it's maybe it's time to test those skills again.
If you ever want to learn, let me know.
Okay, I will.
I'll bring my deck from 1999.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be
I'll
nostalgia.
bring my skills from 1999.
Oh, man. Well, it was lovely to talk to you both. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
If people wanted to buy the book, where could they go? And when it comes out December 5th.
December 5th.
It's called Dragon Talk, and it has like, does it have a subtitle to it?
Oh, does it ever?
Because like D&D books like to have them some subtitles.
Especially Shelly's.
I love a long subtitle. It is called Welcome to Dragon Talk, inspiring conversations about Dungeons and Dragons and the people who love to play it.
That's a title.
A title and a half. You could just, so
the title gets bonuses.
Yep. Yes. Wherever you like to purchase your books, you can certainly find it there, and it is available for pre-order now. But the official release is December 5th, just in time for holidays.
And where could they find you two and your content if they wanted to explore more of your lovely speaking voices?
If you'd like to get some tips on how to play magic, follow me by all means. I am at Shelly Moo on Twitter and Instagram, or you can visit my website at shellymazzanoble.com. And of course, you can listen to Dragon Talk wherever you download your podcasts.
And I'm at Greg Tito on Twitter for now, and at Greg _ Tito. I did just sign up for co-host where I'm at Greg Tito there. I don't know if that's gonna.
Yeah,
you didn't have to do the underscore there.
I didn't have to do the underscore, so I wanted to.
I signed up for Mastodon and co-host and whatever the hell else is there
and all that. Right.
I'm too lazy and too old to deal with this stuff. I'm just gonna hang out in the Muskyverse until he shuts the door.
I hear that, but you can find us all there, and of course, listen to Dragon Talk. We when all these interviews that we've done, we were always like, oh yeah, not just the book, like sure, go buy that, but listen to us. The
podcast is good. I like it a lot. I enjoy it quite a bit. You should have me.
We should.
Yes, we should.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
But as always, you can find me at Gearpuri Gears. You can find this podcast anywhere podcasts are sold, or at Cool Stuff Inc. on Tuesdays, or at YouTube on Thursdays. Thank you, EK. And remember, my friends, it is not magic without the gathering, and we will see you next time.